Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chari-Wagh, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module Relevance, Decline and Renewal of Agrarian Studies, Part 1. This module is part of the paper Agrarian Relations and Social Structure in India that is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. What are the important issues that this module raises? It talks about gradual transformation of the image of the village. Further, it also refers to changing features of the agrarian and village studies in India. Further, it also discusses the colonial and nationalist constructions of the Indian village, and it ends by agrarian structure and politics. Colonial and nationalist constructions of village. Since the colonial times, the idea of village has undergone enormous change. The colonial powers in India viewed villages as a basic unit of investigation as they recognized the ideological character of village. Villages made the new land in the control of the British intelligible and manageable. It was the caste structure of the village that helped them to understand the uniqueness of the people of India. The caste system and the village community were the two important categories of colonial ethnography which was created to make sense of the Indian society and distinguish it from the West. The ethnographic studies during the colonial created an image of the village India that has lasting ideological and political implications. The writings of James Mill and Sir Charles Metcalfe had inspired the later writings on Indian village. Metcalfe, a British administrator, had made a remark about Indian villages which was long celebrated. According to him, village community were little republics having everything they wanted within themselves and almost independent of foreign relations. The idea that village community lasted even after tumbling down of several dynasties were established and seen as distinguishing feature of Indian village. Though not all colonial administrators shared Metcalfe's assessment, it was the most widely accepted representation of India. The Indian village was attributed with diverse features like simplicity, stagnation, social harmony, and marked by functional integration of various occupational groups. It was pointed out by Marx and Engels also that given the features of Indian village, the British rule would create conditions for a social revolution in India. Ethnographic studies by colonial administrators helped in the development of theories of society and history in the 19th and early 20th century. Citing Breman's four components of village and colonial discourse: political economy, political autonomy, economic autarky, social homogeneity, and tenacious immutability of the close collectivity, Jyotka argues that such a construction helped the colonial rulers rationalize their dominance. For them, village brought out the reality of India, which made it easier for them to legitimize their rule. As village was seen as an unchanging reality of village republics which remain untouched from the Hindus, Mughals, or the Sikhs, the rule by the Britons will also make no difference. The rulers would remain outsiders and the village characteristics would remain intact. The idea of village and the knowledge of colonial rulers about the village were of great importance for the native middle class elite. In modern India, the historians have pointed out the continuity between colonial category of knowledge and the nationalist thinking. The idea of village was given the nationalist leaders and political agenda was to recover the real India. In spite of the presence of urban centers like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, it was a rural hinterland that was seen to carry the essence of Indianness. As cited in Jyotka, Bete says that village has an important ideological category, which is not only a place to live in but a design which is reflected in the basic Indian values. By the 19th century, village has assumed meanings such as subsistent agriculture, low technology crafts, timelessness of style, immobility of people, and ideological integration with land. The fact that villages remained uninfluenced by the colonial forces contributed in the formulation of nationalist ideologies around the village in the first half of the 19th century. Village, in spite of being much criticized hierarchical structure of caste, was celebrated because of the virtue of being repository of civilization ideas of India and hence fundamental to the idea of the nation. For Mahatma Gandhi, who mobilized an entire nation to achieve freedom, village was the soul of the Indian nation. The nationalists leading the freedom movement made village a powerful political symbol, depicting patriotism. It was village that represented real India or the pure form of Indian life. The nationalist literature was mainly centered on two themes: the need to preserve the basic constitution of Indian villages, and the detrimental effect of the colonial rule on the status of village. The different leaders fighting for the freedom of the nation in the most divergent manners also agreed that modern state machinery had eroded the traditional form of local self-governance, which was fundamental for our freedom. The modern market was threatening the existence of cottage industries on which the village economy rests, and hence a Swadeshi movement was initiated. Beginning of the decline. Soon after the independence, the ideology of self-sufficient village in India, which led to mass mobilization and ultimately gained independence, was overpowered by modernization ideals of Nehru and Ambedkar. Even though the nationalist ideas celebrated village life, they did admit about the scarcity and ignorance that prevailed in the villages. The very qualities of village which was romanticized earlier repelled other radical thinkers in contemporary times. They believed that even though the village preserved society from chaos, it stood for stagnation. For the utilitarian, the progress was the objective which could be obtained only by state intervention and market forces. The bond holding the village community together was a factor holding the individual down, which is important for progress. This was a target for reform. A village community, according to Ambedkar, was a threat to national integrity and also a thriving place for caste system which needed to be reformed. Given his background of belonging to a Dalit family, he represented the most oppressed and marginalized class and had a Dalitist view of the village. He was of the opinion that creating a village as a basic unit of legal structure would be a great calamity. He argued that the idea of village was not natural to Indian civilization but perhaps being derived from colonial or Western imagination of India. He believed that the normative structure of village was radically opposing the spirit of democracy and hence should not occupy the center stage in the new independent state. A more balanced view, albeit critical of the existing idea of village, was held by Nehru. Nehru, who had become the supreme leader of the Congress by the dawn of independence, saw village rather critically. According to him, the village comprised of a peasant class who were the majority in the nation and were living in abject misery. The agrarian economy was exploited by the landlords, whom he described as physically and intellectually degenerate and had outlived their day. Though he agreed with the traditional view of village of Gandhi, he also believed that the agrarian structure is plagued by internal differences and contradictions between the landlord and the peasants. He was a major proponent of industrialization and modernization and believed that technology would be advantageous to the farmers. In his nation-building strategy, industrialization was a priority, but at the same time he also knew that modern industries would not be able to absorb the entire surplus labor population, and hence a cottage industry would also need to be promoted. Programs like community development and land reforms were introduced immediately after independence with a view to reform the village structure. Thus, for Nehru, the village did not have with virtues of the type that called for celebration. Rather, it had problems that required intervention of the state. Similar was the overall perception towards the village as revealed through 5-year plan documents of the Planning Commission. The changed attitude of the national planners of the new welfare state towards the village marked the beginning of the erosion of the sheen of the idealized village pervaded by both the colonial administrators and the nationalist ideologies. The Planning Commission initiatives in the post-independence period saw a plethora of rural development programs ostensibly meant to integrate the village in the larger development process. But while this initiative intended to bring development to village, it was conceptually demarcated it as a world which is distant from the developed world. The professionals and academicians in the field of rural development began to see development as a solution to the problems of the village. However, the new centers of development were but the cities, industries and dams and other temples of the Nehruvian modern India. The policy makers of the new state comprised of elites, and the majority of the leaders had no first-hand experience of a typical village life. The vision of development for nationalist leaders like Nehru and Ranade, with support from business classes in post-independent India, was a modernization through industrialization. Given the process of passive revolution that unfolded in India, old feudal class was not destroyed, agrarian reform was avoided, and popular masses were prevented from growing through the political experience of a fundamental social transformation. The political ideological program of India comprised of ensuring mass support from subordinate class to get independence, but at the same time the pre-independent dominant class was not shaken from its position. Therefore, in the new state by the Indian dominant class with support from the masses. The development initiated after independence therefore began to see signs of its failure, as it could not bring about regional convergence in development or a more equitable society. The initiatives taken to bring a qualitative change in the lives of the rural people, like land reforms and community development programs, have largely failed. Not surprisingly, most of the aspiring people want to leave the village if given an option. In our times, a village has turned to be some sort of waiting room, with the inhabitants often being at various points of real or imaginary transit to that ultimate destination, the town or the city. As a consequence, the status of village in the economy and its popular imagination has considerably declined. There would no longer be a cinematic presentation of the village in the nationalist dream. The urban life and culture have come to be increasingly glorified in art and cinema, and this imagery has permeated the minds of not only people living in urban centers but also in the villages. Inhabitants of the village have begun to increasingly being influenced by urban glamour, and there is no gainsaying that Indian village reality has undergone a change, not only economically but also culturally. The factors responsible for such changes are at the structural level. The landholding pattern of the village is such that there are few employment avenues in the village, and that too suboptimum in nature. The increase in the reach of the roads and railways has made movement to urban centers relatively easily, with which there is an influx of the urban spirit in rural areas. A villager has no difficulty in accepting himself or herself inferior to those living in the cities, and has a persistent aspiration of being able to eliminate the cultural gap. The new generation in the village is living there, but it is largely detached from the agrarian economy or its normative structure. The spread of education has had a significant influence on the young minds of the village that motivates them to dream about an urban life. The life of the people working in modern cities is seen as positive development and not perceived as a process of pauperization or forcible separation from land. Moving to cities is either a voluntary step taken by people who have been living in villages in the past. Since the 70s, there has been a series of social, cultural, political instances which has distorted agrarian character and caste hierarchy of village. The widespread participation of the lower caste people in the political arena through formation of Dalit parties has led to the breakdown of the caste structure, which was fundamental to the concept of village. In the underdeveloped pockets of the country, there have been several agitations against lack of employment opportunities and deplorable living conditions existing in the rural area. On the other hand, development of cities has produced immense power to the new aspiring middle class. The popular media is motivated by an interest of this middle class, which has assumed great importance in the new liberal political economic environment in the country. Transformation of the agrarian, the underlying forces. Influence of the economic structure. The village of modern times is qualitatively different from what it was imagined to be. Statistics point out the failing rates of the growth in agriculture and increasing migration from the countryside to towns. Even in the villages, the non-farm employment has increased tremendously over the years. Nearly 24% of the villagers are engaged in non-farm employment, which is a substantial share of labor population. The contribution of agriculture in GDP has also dwindled. Besides, there is a gender undermining of the rural ethos. No longer would a farmer from Punjab proudly claim that farming is the noblest of all professions. Everybody wants an urban foothold, and there is disenchantment from villages on various fronts. Agriculture sector in India remains largely dependent on monsoons even today. Even in regions where green revolution has a significant impact, the dependence on vagaries of weather has not been eliminated altogether. This has been given the reasons of to the village people to migrate to cities, where they also the quality of life is not so good. Landholding in village are small in spite of the land reforms undertaken after independence. Approximately 85% of the land holdings are below 5 acres and 63% is below 3 acres. The limited number of economic opportunities is also due to the social relations, which are even today dominated by caste hierarchy. The economic status of village is a result of the overall development strategy adopted by the Indian state in post-independence period. There was a conscious attempt to limit the degree of openness and integration with the world economy to become more self-reliant. The state had assumed the role of the planner for development because market in itself was not perceived to be sufficient to meet the aspirations of a nation which began to industrialize late. India had adopted the model of a developmental state, and industrialization was agreed upon as the most appropriate strategy. The objective was very clearly put down to as catching up with the industrialized world and in the process improving the standard of living of the people. In this context, agriculture was seen as a sector with diminishing returns. Industrialization was agreed as a promising sector which would create productive employment and absorb surplus labor from the rural sector. Economic policies were shaped based on these perceptions. Public investment was made to establish capital-intensive industries and an industrial licensing system was adopted to guide allocation of resources. Agriculture in the entire process was relatively neglected. The neglect of agricultural sector led to the persistence of poverty in rural areas. As Michael Lipton argues, the major reason for sustenance of poverty is urban bias. Urban centers have been given priority in the process of allocation of scarce physical, financial and human resources. This has further increased the gap between the rich and the poor. Mass poverty remains alongside development because development process does not create conditions of mass consumption. Even though this gap existing within the society is glaring, it still exists because policymakers are insulated from the experience of poverty. Most of the politicians and bureaucrats are selected from towns and hence have limited capacity to understand the needs of the poor majority. Even when there is pro-poor rhetoric, the policy makers are protected from any kind of political pressure that can possibly arise in democracy. This is possible because the policy making machinery, that is planning commission, and policy implementation machinery, that is administrative structure, is kept outside the political arena. As is explained by Chatterjee, the objective of development led to the decision of keeping the planning process away from political influence. Curiously, grand efforts towards development notwithstanding, mass poverty continued to exist alongside economic growth. State intervention through planning was mainly to develop industrial capitalism, as it was assumed to be synonymous to development. In spite of claiming to be inclined towards socialism, planning had pursued modernization through industrialization. The political arena was dominated by elites. Unlike revolution, the dominant class was not overthrown. Land reforms and initiatives for agrarian development over the years had failed. Development process hence did not qualify as being driven by a real revolution. However, the establishment of democracy indeed provided an avenue for expression by the masses. The uniqueness of the Indian capitalist process lies in the fact that the primitive accumulation of capital and welfare measures as a part of passive revolution was carried out simultaneously. Primitive accumulation through separation of producers from the means of production was carried on along with the provisions by the government agencies to provide them with basic needs of livelihood. This was required as in India the larger conditions under which capitalism was getting established were different from when the same was happening in the West. Europe could deal with the surplus labor created by land disposition by resettling them in colonies. Capitalist growth then was also far less capital intensive, which resulted in the creation of jobs for the dispossessed people. Under these circumstances, the industrialization process driven by planning could not lead to improvement in the conditions of poverty and inequality of the initial years of planning. Socio-political factors. In addition to the economic reasons for the decline of the position of rural India in popular imagination, there were also social factors at play. The caste structure is a distinguishing feature of the village community. The chief patrons of the village were members of the dominant class, and even after independence, the traditional upper caste continued to be the ruling class. There has been continued tension between the agrarian classes. Bose has brought about the severity of power asymmetry between agrarian classes. The abundance of studies focusing on inequality persistent in the rural society has changed the supposedly tranquil picture of the village. In the past, the caste structure was responsible for romanticizing the Jajmani system. It provided the locus for each of the castes to be placed in the hierarchy of purity, accepting Brahmins at the top. But soon, the unequal distribution of wealth responsible for the caste structure was understood, and ideological acquisitions fundamental to the caste structure was challenged. It has been argued that every caste valued itself and its rituals were the origin tales of these castes, and recalling a supposedly lower caste actually held a high caste and the high status in the distant past. Loss of the status of these castes were attributed to reversal of vast, deceit and idiosyncratic gods. It is argued that the so-called lower caste never participated willingly in its own subjugation. Idea of unconditional dominance is therefore a thing of the past, and caste identities have begun to become more strident and are expressed more openly today. Even though until 1977 the upper caste continued to hold prominence in Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state in the Indian Union, the traditional peasant castes such as Ahirs, Kurmis, Kueri, Lodh, Rajputs and Jats soon began to dominate the political landscape of northern India. In southern parts of India, the Vanyas and Tevas became assertive. The power was taken over by the mid-50s from the rural elite within the Congress party. In northern India, in 1977, for the first time, upper caste members in the parliament fell below 50%. The Congress was challenged by the coalition of peasant caste led by Charan Singh in Uttar Pradesh. In Bihar also, there was a significant weakening of the hold of upper caste members in the Legislative Assembly post-1977. The decline of the rural elite in the traditional politics has been discussed by Rudolphs, who refer to this new ascendant peasant caste as bullock capitalists. They challenged the traditional hegemony of Kshatriyas as Rajputs and Bhumihars, as they controlled 51% of land but constituted 34% of the population. Not only there was an emergence of the so-called landed peasant caste in politics, the backward classes also made their presence felt. The reason behind this political churning was that in the independent India, gradually the backward classes could become assertive because of the property classes in rural India could not dominate the landless peasants because of the abolition of the zamindari system. The power of the landlords as patrons had diminished as the size of the land holdings had shrunk. The result of abolition of the feudal system in India was that the preeminence of the traditional landlords was lost and the middle peasants of bullock capitalists ascended in the power ladder. The hitherto backward caste had begun to challenge the social superiors. The lower caste Chamas in Punjab had begun to identify themselves as Adi Dharmas and establish their own Gurudwaras even without formally rejecting Sikhism. They stopped visiting Gurudwaras controlled by Jat Sikhs and distanced themselves from them. They worshipped Guru Ravidas in their Gurudwaras and gave up wearing turban and growing beard. The Ramgharyas or the carpenters by caste occupation in Talhan village in Jalandhar have also been drawn into the Adi Dharma fold. Through the social attendance of Adi Dharmis is not approved by the church, they have ended up being spectators of the prosperity. In parts outside Jalandhar also, people belonging to this community refuse to do menial work or work as agricultural labourers in the fields owned by Jats. The traditional scavengers known as Mazhabi Sikhs have now begun to take up jobs in the fields but have not been able to become as assertive as Adi Dharmis. In spite of this, the dominant trend has been to look for livelihood options in the non-agrarian sector while residing in the villages. Village people have largely begun to prefer working as coolies and rickshaw pullers in urban areas and work in farms as it provides them some level of economic certainty. A similar trend can be seen in the states of Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. The scheduled caste in these states have begun to have temples of their own, defying the old age traditions of untouchability. The caste identity therefore has resurfaced at odd levels and every caste is claiming an elevated status. Citing M.N. Srinivas, Shah argues that caste as a system which formed the basis of production structure in rural India is dead and the idea of individual caste is thriving. Hierarchy, which was essential to the system, is breaking down the influence of new values of democracy, equality and self-respect. The village economy is no longer closed and hence oligarchs of the traditionally dominant caste cannot subjugate the lower caste. The communities of the lower rungs of caste hierarchy can now express their sense of self-worth and are ready to come out of the shackles which constricted their development. The social and cultural heterogeneity of the city also provides a congenial ground for innovative change which helps the movement against caste hierarchy. The number of social thinkers who have been working against hierarchical structure of caste system were from the urban centers. It has also been pointed out that the individual forces of the urban centers influence the rural areas also. It has been discussed also by Sheth as secularization of caste, which comprises of deritualization and politicization of caste. These processes have taken place in urban centers and refer to the elimination of socio-religious content of economic relationship in village. The Jajmani system, which regulated economic transactions in the village, was replaced by contractual relation between employer and employee. It can hence be said that the social relations which are sustained by internal food production system of a village was based on caste had virtually disintegrated. Also, the Green Revolution and the increasing role of the state and outside agencies in food production had changed the social organization of village substantially. Village was no longer the social religious system but an economic organization which supplied food. The politics of the caste has resulted in securing the system of reservation in Indian society. With the failure of Congress parties, politics in minimizing poverty and inequality after 2 decades of independence, the ground was created for the formation of parties representing interests of the poor and marginalized who mainly belong to the lower caste. The regional political parties proliferated in several states which led to more competition in politics. This led to substitution of vertical power relation with horizontal power relations. The upwardly mobile and dominant class, which were traditionally of lower status, strengthened their caste based on caste-based politics, with a new middle class emerged. This new middle class was no longer the English-speaking upper caste, but backward classes. SCs and the STs were received the benefits of reservation and employment. With the recommendations of the Mandal Commission in the late 1980s, classification of caste occurred. This basically meant all individual members of the caste were released from the religiously sanctioned techno-economic and social organization. Also, their interests were linked to the organization relevant to urban industrial system and modern politics. This process was going on in urban as well as rural areas, which led to fundamental change in the social structure. The economic processes undertaken through planning was important, and the focus in the initial decades of planning for economic development was clearly on industrialization and modernization. Agriculture came into focus only for a limited time, mainly due to the food crisis in the 1960s. There was no place for agriculture in the plan framework. In the path of development, the stylizations suggested sectorial and labor transformation from agriculture to industrial service sector. In India, however, transition led to a crisis in the agrarian sector. The decline of the growth rates, productivity and profitability in agriculture in the last 2 decades had led to the crisis in the agriculture sector. The output for small and marginal farms is meager and cannot even guarantee subsistence for the peasants. The recent increase in the farmer suicides in different states confirms a widespread distress in agriculture sector. Sainath has explored and established the structural factors underlying the crisis which leads to farmer suicide. The per capita real income of agriculture dependent population has been stagnant between 1994 and 2004, when the real income of the entire economy was increasing at the rate of 4%. The per capita food production has also declined, leading to a large section of the population to food vulnerability, leading to hunger and malnutrition. The problem of landlessness has also increased because of agrarian distress, which has further overcrowded the agricultural labor market. The agricultural extension services provided by government and research in agriculture have also weakened since the early 1990s. P. Sainath, through his work, has continuously pointed out that the multinational seed corporations, through their exorbitant price structure, has created adverse conditions for the farmers. The withdrawal of the state has led to weak public provisioning in the area of agriculture. The consequences of such neglect may prove to be perilous. It has destroyed the dignity of profession which lies in the heart of rural India. Rural India has in the recent times witnessed several types of conflicts which have not necessarily been between agricultural labor and landlord used to be in the case in 1970s or earlier. The political parties then kept the interest of the rural India and the farmers alive as part of the political agenda. Since large-scale mobilization of people on agrarian issues is no longer seen in today, mass organization and political parties have lost their focus on agrarian issues because agriculture is no longer seen as a critical issue which involves masses of rural people. By the 1980s, landless agricultural laborers had become weak voice with poor representation in the political arena. The leading farmer agitations were the ones espousing the interest of the owner cultivators, and it was clearly stated that anybody who did not own a land was not a farmer. The political agenda of the major parties had very little to do with issues of rural India. Though the politics of caste had become a major election strategy, the parties never committed themselves to the chemistry of the village. In conclusion to this module, students would have a general idea about a general decline of agrarian issues in popular and scholarly discourses. They would also have an understanding about how village is not an interesting concept of study for many scholars now. Therefore, you find not many scholars really interested in studying villages. Further, the module also refers to agrarian issues not only in crisis situation such as in terms of drought, floods and famine, but also in terms of how only these issues really bring on the interest in village studies, and in the whole there has been a decline of agrarian studies in India. Thank you.